Hi, welcome back. We are reading the exciting, wonderful tales of the fairy tale detectives, Sisters Grimm. And let's get right into it. Let's talk about what just happened. We have Daphne and Sabrina, and basically they're learning that their grandma, which Daphne believes is her grandma, but Sabrina is like, no, is like a detective. And she doesn't really know what they're trying to find. Things are a little bit weird, but they just saw that at the house that they were looking at, that something happened. There's a big, huge footprint, like a giant's footprint, right? And the grandma thinks that she found a beanstalk leaf. So they don't really know what's going on. Daphne is just excited about everything, but Sabrina is extremely confused. She's the older one, right? So let's jump into it. Chapter 3. Mrs. Grimm and Mr. Canis were pulling a prank on them. It explained why Mrs. Grimm talked to the house and served her crazy food, and why Mr. Canis said so little and acted so weird. They were trying to make the girls look stupid, which made Sabrina furious. And worse, the joke didn't seem to end. They spent the rest of the day tracing over the field for more clues until Mrs. Grimm looked at her wristwatch and said they better get home for dinner. At the house, Mrs. Grimm prepared a huge plate of meatballs for the girls, complete with purple gravy, the recipe for which she claimed she'd gotten from the Tibetan monk. Too hungry to resist, Sabrina cut a meatball in half to make sure there wasn't any poison pills in them, and finding none, she took a bite. Tasted like pizza. She devoured the plateful and was working on her seconds when Mrs. Grimm joined them, placing a weathered old book on the table. "So we've got a mystery on our hands, Liebling. We should do some research. A good detective always does a research. Let's see, giants. What do we know about them? Oh, here we go. Taylor and the giant," she said as she flipped through the pages. "Okay, you've had your fun," Sabrina said fiercely. "Don't you think we're a little too old to fall for your joke?" Mrs. Grimm looked up from her book in astonishment. Astonishment is like, what are you talking about? "Oh dear, I knew your father wasn't to distance himself, but I never imagined he wouldn't have at least taught you the basics," the old woman said. "No wonder you two have been looking at me like I'm crazy." "What are you talking about?" Sabrina said. "I'm talking about this," Mrs. Grimm said as she flipped the book to the first page. "Grimm's Fairy Tales," Daphne read aloud. The old woman flipped to the next page. On it were portraits of two very ugly men. "Do you know who these men are?" she asked the girls. The girls didn't. "These men were Jacob and William Grimm, also known as the Brothers Grimm," said William. "William was your great-great-great-grandfather," said the old woman as she pointed to the portrait of a thin man with a large nose, tiny eyes, and long hair. "Grimm's Fairy Tales? The fairy tale guys?" Daphne cried. "Yes, Liebling, the fairy tale guys. But there's nothing in that book that's a fairy tale. This is a history book. Every story is an account of something that really happened." The girls looked at each other, unsure of what to say. "But when Jacob and William were alive, fairy tale creatures were still living among us," Mrs. Grimm continued. "You could still wake up and find a giant beanstalk on your farm, or pixies in your barn, or see a knight fight a dragon. But things were changing. For a long time, a tension had been building between humans and fairy tale creatures. Ever-afters were being persecuted, even arrested or forced into hiding, just because they were different. Magic was banned, and dragons were captured and caged. The brothers realized that the age of fairy tales might be coming to an end, so they set out to document as many stories as they could, for poetrys's sake. Some of the things they wrote about in their book happened hundreds of years before they were born, while others, Jacob and William, witnessed themselves. Naturally, as they collected these tales, they made a lot of friends of ever-afters." "What's an ever-after?" Daphne asked. "That's what fairy tale creatures call themselves. After all, fairy tale creatures imply that they are all some sort of monsters or animals. Many of them are human, or once were, before a spell changed them. They can be quite touchy about it. So, like generations of poor and persecuted before them, many ever-afters decided to move to America. But then, so much of this country hadn't been settled that for a group of folks trying to keep a low profile, it seemed like the ideal place to live and thrive. William acted as their ambassador. He found ships and used his connections to buy 5 square miles on the Hudson River. The ever-afters built this town on the land. More ever-afters came here from all over the world, and for a long time everyone lived together in peace. But inevitably, human beings started to move into Fairyport Landing, and soon the ever-afters felt endangered again. Willem tried to convince everyone that there was nothing to worry about, but a small and vocal group of rebels argued that it was just a matter of time before they would be persecuted again. They saw humanity as an infestation that needed to be rooted out at the source and being tormenting the humans who had once been their friends. That's not nice, Daphne said. I agree, but fear can make people do terrible things. Willem tried everything he could, but the rebels' popularity and numbers were growing. It wasn't long before a plan was discovered by Willem to conquer Cold Spring, the next town over, and make it part of Fairyport's territory. Desperate to prevent what would surely be an all-out war between ever-afters and humans, Willem went to the most powerful witch in town, Baba Yaga. Together, they cast a spell on the town, preventing any of the ever-afters from leaving. And then what? Daphne asked. Sabrina watched her sister's eyes widening. She seemed to believe every word the old woman had said, and even if she didn't really, the little girl was happy enough to want to hear to believe. Then the problems really began, especially for Willem. The old woman said, You see, to get Baba Yaga to cast such a powerful spell, Willem had to sacrifice something of his own. Magic always has a price, and what the old witch wanted was what Willem had taken from the ever-afters, his freedom. It's a price that hangs over our family to this day. A Grimm must stay in Fairyport Landing, just like the ever-afters, as long as the spell is intact. It's the reason I couldn't come to the orphanage to get you myself. Isn't there something that could break the spell? Said Daphne. Yes, there is, Mrs. Grimm said as she shifted in her chair. The spell will be broken when the last member of the family is dead. When there are no more Grimms, the ever-afters will be free. What a bummer, Sabrina said. Indeed, Mrs. Grimm said, ignoring Sabrina's sarcasm. But we will make the best of it, and so do most of the ever-afters. They keep a low profile, buying homes and starting businesses. Some have families and even given up their magical powers and possessions in hopes of living more normal lives. And with a couple of exceptions, things have been pretty peaceful in Fairyport Landing between humans and ever-afters. But just a look through Jacob and Willem's book and the books of Hans Christian Andersen, Andrew Lang, Lewis Carroll, Jonathan Swift, and countless other chronicles of ever-afters show you how fragile the peace is, and that trouble could be right around the corner. So like Willem, we have responsibilities of keeping this pot from boiling over. We watch the town, investigate strange or criminal activities, and document what we see. So when we are gone, our children will know what we went through. Think of us as detectives. Someday I will pass this on to you, as your Opa Basil passed it on to me when he died. It's your destiny. We are Grimms, and this is what we do. But why didn't you pass it on to Dad? Daphne wondered. Your grandfather lost his life because of our responsibilities, the old woman said as she lowered her eyes. Henry wanted something else for his children. So when your mother became pregnant with you, Sabrina, they left Fairyport Landing. He wanted to protect you and give you normal lives, even if it meant telling you I was dead. Don't talk about my mom and dad like you knew them, Sabrina shouted. The rage inside her was bubbling. I've sat here listening to your silly stories, but you're not going to tell a fairy tale about my parents. The old woman was startled and tried to stammer out an answer, but Sabrina wouldn't let her. She had Mrs. Grimm on the ropes, and she wasn't going to let her go. You are not our grandmother, the girl raged. Our grandmother died before we were born. That's what my dad told us. Your dad lied to you, Liebling. Henry tried to run from his destiny. He didn't want his life for you, but it's your destiny as well. You being here is evidence enough that it is impossible to escape. You will see the truth soon enough, and when you do, we will prepare you for what lies ahead. My father never told a lie in his life, Sabrina cried. The old woman laughed as she got up from the table. It sounds like he hid more from you than your family history. I'm sure you need some time to let this sink in. And I have some things I need from upstairs. We're going to the hospital to see the farmer who owned that house. He might be able to tell us more about what he saw. She left the room and went upstairs, where the girls could hear the jangling of keys and knew she was opening the secret room. "That woman is a lunatic," Sabrina whispered. "She is not," Daphne cried. "What's a lunatic?" "A crazy person. She thinks people live in the woods. She's nailed all the windows shut and she talks to the house. And now she thinks fairy tales and giants are real. We can't stay here." "What if I don't want to go?" "You don't get it. Mom and Dad put me in charge when they weren't around, and you have to do what I tell you to do." "You're not the boss of me." Daphne crossed her arms in front of her chest and huffed. "We're out of here as soon as I get a chance," Sabrina declared. After dinner, they were off to the hospital, where Mr. Canis was driving again. Asking the old woman questions was pointless, as the car was as loud as ever. Once they had arrived at the hospital and Mr. Canis had turned off the engine, Mrs. Grimm said to the children, "Okay, let's review what we need to do." The previous night was catching up with Sabrina. She was so tired she didn't even have the energy to argue. First, a farmhouse was destroyed, but what appeared to have a giant footprint, sounded the destruction. Mrs. Grimm continued. Second, a giant beanstalk leaf was found at the scene, a definite sign of a giant, and it had been touched by a giant. "How do you know that?" Sabrina asked. "Because Elvis smelled its scent on the leaf." "How does Elvis know what a giant smells like?" "Because," Mrs. Grimm said, pulling the brown fabric out of her handbag that she had held under the dog's nose that morning. "He smelled this. It's a cloth from a giant's trousers. Take a sniff." Daphne smelled the piece of cloth and looked as if she might be sick. "Ugh! Everything has its own particular scent, but giants are really stinky," the old woman explained. "Everybody and everything they touch will stink like them. I know Elvis's nose would find us help a clue." "That's nonsense," Sabrina said, with equal amounts of scorn and exhaustion. Mrs. Grimm ignored Sabrina's protests. "Of course, there's also the lens cap from a video camera we found on the hill overlooking the farm. My guess is the criminal wanted to videotape the giant when he arrived. And lastly, Mayor Charming show up, and Is Mayor Charming Prince Charming?" Daphne asked. "Why, yes, Liebling." The girls squealed in delight. "We met a celebrity!" Mrs. Grimm chuckled and then broke into a full laugh when she noticed the scowl on Mr. Canis's face. "As I was saying, Mayor Charming showed up and tried to get us to give up the investigation," Mrs. Grimm continued. "If this was just an accident, he wouldn't have bothered to come by and check in. When he first arrived, he was angry that someone he called the Three hadn't done a good job cleaning up the place," Daphne offered. "The Three isn't a person. They're a coven of witches. Glinda the Good Witch of the North, Morgan Le Fay, the gingerbread house witch, and Frau Frau. They work for the mayor. He called them magical advisors, but they really just sweep whatever trouble there is under the carpet." "I thought you said the ever-afters gave up their magic," Sabrina said, hoping she'd caught the old woman in a lie. "No, I said some of them did, and in most cases it was voluntary. But I'm sure there's plenty of stuff hidden away in closets and attics all over Fairyport Landing," Mrs. Grimm replied, "including apparently a magic bean I wasn't aware of." Fairyport Landing Memorial Hospital was tiny, at least small compared to the giant skyscraper hospitals Sabrina was familiar with in New York City. It only had 2 floors and no ambulances in front of the emergency room. They left Mr. Canis in the car and they headed inside, past a short, squat man and his 2 huge companions waiting by the hospital door. They were impeccably dressed in expensive suits, perfectly tailored for their frames. Now that means they fit them perfectly. "We look like idiots," Sabrina thought as she tried to tug her high-water pants down a little. Inside, doctors and nurses rushed around the brightly lit hallways. The place smelled of cleaner, which tickled Sabrina's nose. The 3 Grimms managed to maneuver through the chaos and approach the information desk, where a portly receptionist sat talking on the phone. He had a large, round face and a toothy grin, and when he saw them, he put the phone to his chest. "Can I help you, ladies?" "Oh, yes, the man whose house blew up, he's in room 2222, the receptionist cried. "Popular fellow, he just had 3 people up to see him." Mrs. Grimm looked. "Indeed? Well, is there somewhere I should sign in?" The receptionist handed the old woman a clipboard. Before she handed it back, she quickly pointed out 3 names on the list to the girls. Mr. William Charming, a Mr. Seven, and a Mrs. Glinda North had signed it 10 minutes ago. Girls, we have to hurry. They rushed down the hallway through two double doors and made a left up the elevator, stopping at the elevator. Mrs. Grimm pushed the up button several times. Why are we rushing? Sabrina asked. Because Charming is here to erase the farmer's memory, the old woman said as the elevator door slid open and they stepped inside. They got out on the second floor, found 222, and rushed inside. On the bed was Thomas Appleby, a graying old man with his left arm in a sling and his right leg encased in plaster and held like a cast. The poor man looked lucky to be asleep. Suddenly, over him was Mayor Charming, Mr. Seven still wearing his insulting hat, and a rather chubby woman wearing a diamond tiara and a silver and gold dress. The woman was slowly emptying a bag of pink dust onto the sleeping patient. When she saw Mrs. Grimm, she dumped the contents all over the man and shoved the bag in her purse. "Glinda, you've erased his memory," Mrs. Grimm cried. "I thought you were supposed to be a good witch." The witch's face flushed red. She lowered her head and quickly made her way to the door. "We all have to pay our bills, Relda," Glinda said as she walked out. "Save that," Charming added as he and Mr. Seven followed. "This is part of my job." Okay, there's a picture. So it looks like there's Glinda. There's the farmer. I'm assuming that's Mayor Charming, and it looks like she's erasing his memory. Oh, sounds a little fishy to me. Mrs. Grimm looked discouraged. "Oh, he'll never be able to tell us anything. And without an eyewitness account, we're never going to get to the bottom of this." After several seconds, she poked her head out of the room. "They're gone." "What are we doing here?" Sabrina asked. She didn't feel comfortable waiting around in the hospital room with a man that she didn't even know, especially after people had been dumping what looked like contents of a vacuum cleaner bag all over him. "We're waiting." "For who?" Daphne asked, but no sooner had she said that than a frail old woman with gray hair entered the room. When she saw Mrs. Grimm and the girls, she got a worried look on her face. "Mrs. Appleby, I'm Relda Grimm, and these are my granddaughters, Sabrina and Daphne. We heard about the accident. Are you okay?" "Okay, I'm fine. Thank you for asking. Do you know my husband?" "Oh, no, we're just concerned citizens and neighbors. I happen to be a little detective work from time to time, and I was thinking I might be able to help. How's your husband?" Mrs. Appleby gazed down at the broken man and smiled sadly. "To be honest, I'm a little worried about him. He was raving earlier. The doctors gave him a sedative to calm him down. Wait a minute, he's waking up," she said as he began to stir. "Thomas, how are you feeling?" Mrs. Appleby asked as she sat next to his bed and rubbed his hand. "Deborah, who are these people?" the farmer asked his wife. "They're with the police," Mrs. Appleby replied. Mrs. Grimm stepped forward. "Not the police, dear. I'm a detective of sorts. Mr. Appleby, my name is Relda Grimm, and these are my granddaughters. I'm very glad to see that you weren't badly injured." "You three are detectives?" Mr. Appleby looked. Yes, Mrs. Grimm, causing Daphne to practically swell with pride. "Well, I think a crime has been committed, Mrs. Grimm," Mr. Appleby said. "You do? They should arrest whoever dressed your granddaughters this morning." "Thomas, stop it. I think they look adorable," Mrs. Appleby said. "I'm sorry, he's been a grouch since we got here. He doesn't like hospitals." Sabrina looked down at her goofy outfit. Why would buy a girl who almost 12 a shirt with a monkey on it? "Well, what can I do for you, Mrs. Grimm?" Mr. Appleby said. "Do you remember anything about the accident?" the old woman said. "What accident?" the farmer said. Mrs. Grimm frowned. "What accident?" Mrs. Appleby exclaimed. "Thomas, the house has been destroyed, and I found you lying in the yard." "I don't think I know what you're talking about. There's nothing wrong with the house," Mr. Appleby argued. "Oh dear, the painkillers are really doing a number on you," Mrs. Appleby said, shifting anxiously in her seat. The farmer returned his wife's stare with an innocent look. "Mrs. Grimm, I don't think my husband is up to discussing the case right now." "I understand. Perhaps you might have a moment to spare then?" "Of course," Mrs. Appleby gestured for them to follow her into the hallway. "So sorry to trouble you," Mrs. Grimm said. "I do hope you feel better soon, Mr. Appleby." Daphne stopped and turned into the injured man. I like my outfit, she said, and stuck her tongue out. Mr. Appleby stuck his tongue out too, and the little girl stomped away. He's acting very odd right now, Mrs. Appleby said. I'm considering taking him out of the hospital. Oh, I'm sure he's in good hands. So he was raving about what? Oh, it's silly. He swore he saw a giant. Oh, well, wouldn't that be a sight? Mrs. Grimm chuckled. But I have a different theory about what happened, Mrs. Appleby explained. There was a British man out in the farm several times asking us if we would rent the place out to him for a couple of nights. He said he needed the field for a special event, but only a couple of days. At first he was very friendly, but then when Thomas refused, he got quite nasty. Has he come back? Mrs. Grimm asked. Well, that's just it. A week later he did come and apologized for being so rude. He said he wanted to make it up to us, so he booked us a fancy hotel in New York City, all expenses paid for, and tickets to a Broadway show. We hadn't had a vacation in years. Farming is a tough business, so I accepted. How nice. Did you enjoy your vacation? Not at all. When I got there, I found out the hotel didn't have any record of our reservation, and the tickets to the show, they were not real, Mrs. Appleby said angrily. You say you found out. Did your husband go with you? Mrs. Grimm said. Oh, no. Thomas doesn't care for the city. I took my sister. We had to use our own money for the hotel, and the only place with a room all had bed bugs. How dreadful, Mrs. Grimm sympathized. Mrs. Appleby, this man's name didn't happen to be Charming, did it? Oh, no, it was an Englishman. What did this Englishman look like? I'm sorry, I never saw him. Thomas had all the dealings with them. One last question, Mrs. Appleby. I'm sure you want to get back to your husband. Do either of you have a video camera? Mrs. Grimm took a clean handkerchief out of her handbag and offered it to the woman. Sabrina noticed that a soft pink powder fell from the handkerchief as the woman wiped her eyes. No, we don't. Mr. Appleby is a little tight with money, if you know what I mean. Suddenly, Sabrina noticed a change in the woman's face. It seemed to wipe itself of all the emotion, and her eyes drifted back to a blank stare. I'm sorry, have we met? No, but I hear you had a wonderful time in New York City. Okay, Mrs. Appleby said. What just happened? Then she turned and went into her husband's room without saying goodbye. Mrs. Grimm pulled her notebook out of the handbag. So the plot thickens, she said. We can definitely say there was a giant now. There's no such thing as giants, Sabrina said, a bit louder than she meant to. The declaration echoed in the hospital. Sabrina, shouted the woman. You heard the woman, Sabrina said in a lower tone. This Mr. Englishman wanted to rent their farm for some special event. Then when the farmer wouldn't agree, he lost his temper and blew up the place. Charming is probably trying to cover that up because he's in on it. Sabrina, I'm very proud of you, Mrs. Grimm said as she led them to the elevator. You have incredible skills of deduction. You looked at the clues and chose the most likely path to solve the crime. You're going to make a great detective, but how do you explain the footprint? Listen, I don't know where you live, but my sister and I are here on Earth where things can easily be explained without having to consider giants. Maybe whatever Englishman used to blow up the house caused the ground to sink. Brilliant. Those are loose ends in your theory. When someone blows something up, usually pieces fly everywhere. This house looked like it had been squashed from above, Mrs. Grimm pointed out. The elevator stopped and the Grimms stepped inside. The house was stomped on, Daphne said. That's my theory, the old woman said as they left the hospital, and I know who's responsible. Who? I think you'll enjoy it more if it's a surprise. Well, hello, ladies, a voice said as the three men emerged from the deep shadows that lined the pathway to the parking lot. They were the same men in suits who had been staring at them when they entered the hospital. The small dumpy one held onto an iron bar, and he kept smacking it into his gloved hands. The men on either side of him stood looking huge, muscle-bound bookends at their much shorter leader. Good evening, gentlemen, Mrs. Grimm said calmly, despite the fact that one's glance told Sabrina the men were trouble. We hear you've been asking some questions about a certain piece of property, the dumpy leader said. Sabrina saw that his nose had been broken in 3 places. She could tell he was not a man to mess with. Then you've heard correctly, young man, Mrs. Grimm said as she placed herself squarely between the girls and the thugs. Daphne grabbed her sister's hand and squeezed tightly, but Sabrina hardly noticed. She was too awestruck by the old woman's courage. Well, if you know what's good for you, then you'll just forget about the whole thing, the leader said with a wicked grin. That revealed the absence of a front tooth. If I knew what was good for me, I wouldn't be in this line of work, Mrs. Grimm replied. Now, if you'd be so kind, let us pass. I really must get my granddaughters out of this cold night air. In a minute, Relda, the leader grinned. We just want to make sure you understand what we're trying to say. I seem to be a disadvantaged young man. You know my name, but I don't know yours. Or better yet, who the unfortunate employer is who hired the likes of you three. The two big men grunted angrily, but the leader raised his hands to quiet them. No need to get rude, Relda. We're just having a conversation, you know, trying to avoid a confrontation. Boys, Mrs. Grimm said in the tone of someone who has lost her patience, I want you to go back to your boss and tell him that he should know it takes more than 3 thugs to make me give up. Now, good night. She tried to pass the men, but as she did, the leader grabbed her jacket and pulled her close to his fat face. Some people can't take a hint. Mrs. Grimm pulled a little silver whistle from around her neck and blew into it, but no sound could be heard. When she put it back inside her dress, the bullies laughed. I'm warning you, if you don't let us pass, you are going to regret it, she said. Sabrina's heart began to pound. How could Mrs. Grimm be so calm? These men were about to tear her apart. Lady, it's you who's going to have the regret. Okay, guys, so that was chapter 3. I don't know who these people are, but we just learned a lot in this chapter. What on earth is going to happen? So fairy tales are real. Sabrina doesn't believe it. Daphne does. Now they're detectives. They're trying to find a giant. Oh, I don't know about you guys, but I'm excited to see what happens next. And who are these 3 thugs and who hired them? Oh, okay, we'll see you next week.